Brody helps him up, and right up he'll go. All the way up. Brody with that backbreaker he's so famous for.
On 17th July 1988, Bruiser Brody was stabbed in a shower stall and his killer walked free. How did one of wrestling's most feared men end up defenseless and alone? Why did the justice system fail him? This isn't just another wrestling story. It's a tale of betrayal, corruption, and a cover-up that's haunted the industry for decades. By the end of this video, you'll question everything you thought you knew about the dark side of professional wrestling. Before he became the wild man known as Bruiser Brody, Frank Goodish was just a regular guy from Michigan. Well, maybe not so regular. At 6'8" and nearly 300 pounds, Frank stood out wherever he went. But his path to wrestling stardom wasn't a straight line. Frank was a football star in high school and college. He even had a brief stint with the Washington Redskins in the NFL. But when his gridiron dreams fizzled out, Frank turned to journalism. Yeah, you heard that right. The man who would become one of wrestling's most feared monsters started out writing for a newspaper in San Antonio. But Frank couldn't shake the itch for competition. He stumbled into wrestling almost by accident, and that's when everything changed. The mild-mannered journalist disappeared, and Bruiser Brody was born. Frank's wife Barbara saw the transformation firsthand. She once said, "At home, Frank was gentle and kind, but when he became Brody, it was like a switch flipped. He turned into this wild, unpredictable force of nature." For example, Brody was known to shoot on his opponents, meaning he'd hit them for real or refuse to cooperate in the ring. Why? Sometimes to make a point. Sometimes because he felt like it. And sometimes, well, who knows? Take the infamous match with Lex Luger. Halfway through, Brody just stopped. He wouldn't sell Luger's moves, wouldn't play along. The match fell apart, ending in disqualification and confusion. Some say it was Brody's way of protesting a pay dispute. Others say he just didn't feel like working that night. That was Brody, always keeping everyone guessing. Promoters were caught in a real bind with Bruiser. On one hand, he was box office gold. Fans would pack arenas just to see what wild thing he'd do next. On the other hand, he was a promoter's worst nightmare. Would he follow the script? Would he hurt someone for real? Would he even show up? Every Brody match was a roll of the dice. But that unpredictability is exactly what made Brody a worldwide sensation. In Japan, he was treated like a god. In Puerto Rico, he was the biggest draw in history. Speaking of Puerto Rico, this is exactly where everything started. The beginning of his end and the reason why his life would be cut short. The Puerto Rican wrestling scene was unlike anything else in the world. Fans didn't just want to see a match, they craved violence, blood, and real-life drama. And Bruiser Brody, he gave them exactly what they wanted. His matches in Puerto Rico were the stuff of legend. Brutal affairs that left both wrestlers and audience members wondering if they'd gone too far. Remember those insane bouts between Brody and Abdullah the Butcher? Or the time he and Carlos Colon turned the ring into a battlefield? Brody's hardcore style fit perfectly with the island's appetite for destruction. But here's the thing. The danger didn't end when the bell rang. The locker rooms in Puerto Rico were powder kegs, ready to explode at any moment. Personal beefs, professional jealousies, and the blurred line between kayfabe and reality created a toxic mix there. Little by little, as Brody's star power grew, so did the tension. Now, for the murder to actually make sense, I will have to introduce to you Jose Gonzalez. Jose Gonzalez was a big deal in Puerto Rico. Known as Invader One, he wasn't just a wrestler. He was a leader in the World Wrestling Council, Puerto Rico's top wrestling promotion. But his success came with competition, and no one was a bigger threat than Bruiser Brody. For Gonzalez, Brody was more than just competition. He was a danger to everything Gonzalez had built. Rumors spread that Brody wanted a stake in the WWC, which Gonzalez might have seen as a threat to his power. Add in Brody's rising paychecks and popularity, and you had a recipe for disaster. Then there were Gonzalez's chilling words, "One day, I'm gonna end that man." At the time, everyone shrugged it off as wrestling banter. But hindsight makes those words impossible to ignore. On July 16, 1988, everything changed. It was supposed to be a normal night of wrestling at Juan Ramon Lubriel Stadium in Puerto Rico. The locker room was buzzing as wrestlers taped up and planned their matches. But according to those who were there, something felt off. Tony Atlas, one of the wrestlers in the locker room that night, later said, "The air felt heavy, like something bad was about to happen." Brody, as always, stood out, towering over everyone else as he got ready for his match. At around 7:45 p.m., Gonzalez approached him and asked him to step into the shower area to talk. That wasn't unusual. Wrestlers often discussed match details in private, but this time was different. Moments later, two screams shattered the locker room. They were loud and full of pain. Everyone froze. What was going on? Tony Atlas rushed to the shower area, and what he found was horrifying. There was Brody hunched over, blood pouring from a stab wound to his stomach. Standing over him was Gonzalez, holding a knife. The room erupted into chaos. Wrestlers scrambled, trying to figure out what to do. Brody collapsed to the floor, bleeding heavily. Paramedics were called, but when they arrived, they couldn't lift him. He was too big. Tony Atlas had to help them get Brody onto a stretcher. But the nightmare didn't end there. The ambulance got stuck in traffic outside the stadium, losing precious time. Every second counted, and Brody was running out of time. When they finally reached the hospital, doctors worked desperately to save him. Brody underwent 2 emergency surgeries, but the injuries were too severe, and the delays had cost him. That night, Bruiser Brody, the wild man who seemed unstoppable, was gone. When the news came out that Bruiser Brody had died, it felt like a punch to the gut for the wrestling world. It didn't seem real. Brody was larger than life, someone who seemed untouchable. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to him and not like this. His wife Barbara was heartbroken. She couldn't wrap her head around it. Her husband had gone through so many brutal matches and always came out on top. How could this happen now? I know the attacker did it, she said, her voice shaking with anger. From everything I've heard, the court case was a joke. The lack of justice made everything worse, leaving her with more questions than answers. Fans and wrestlers everywhere felt the loss. Wrestling promotions around the world held special tribute shows to honor Brody. His friends and colleagues shared stories about his wild personality and the impact he had on the business. But even with all the tributes, there was an uneasy feeling in the air. If someone as tough and respected as Brody could be killed like this, what did that mean for everyone else in the business? It was a chilling thought. As the shock started to fade, people began asking hard questions. Why was there such a long delay in getting Brody medical help? How could something like this happen in a locker room full of wrestlers? And most importantly, would anyone pay for what happened to him? The fight for answers wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about Brody anymore. It was about shining a light on the darker side of wrestling. Behind the flashy moves and big personalities, there were secrets and power plays that no one wanted to talk about. Justice for Bruiser Brody should have been straightforward. He was a beloved wrestling icon, and the circumstances of his death seemed crystal clear. There was a locker room full of witnesses, a suspect who didn't deny being involved, and a brutal stabbing that left Brody dead. Yet, despite all of this, justice wasn't served. The trial of Jose Gonzalez, the man accused of killing Brody, turned into a chaotic mess. It left fans, wrestlers, and anyone who followed the case wondering, how could this happen? The biggest issue was of the witnesses. Wrestlers like Tony Atlas and Dutch Mantell were there that night. They saw what happened and could have provided crucial testimony in court. But incredibly, they weren't called to testify. In fact, they didn't even get their summons until after the trial had ended. Yes, after. Imagine being invited to a birthday party after the cake's been eaten and everyone's gone home. That's how absurd this situation was. Then there was the investigation itself. The local police initially believed that Brody had been attacked by an angry fan, a fan in the locker room with a knife. Think about that for a second. A locker room is a secure area meant for wrestlers and staff. The idea that a fan could sneak in and commit such a crime was laughable. Yet that's where the police started their investigation. It was like they were solving a mystery in a bad TV show instead of dealing with a real-life murder. When the case finally made it to court, things got even stranger. In Puerto Rico, the legal system works a bit differently than in many other places. For example, a jury doesn't need to reach a unanimous decision to acquit someone. A majority vote is enough to let a defendant go free. This system played a big role in the outcome of the trial. Gonzalez claimed he acted in self-defense. He said that Brody had threatened him and he feared for his life. Without key witnesses to challenge his version of events, the jury believed him. The verdict? Not guilty. Gonzalez walked out of the courtroom a free man, despite the fact that he had stabbed someone in a locker room full of people. The verdict shocked everyone, especially those who were there that night. Tony Atlas, one of Brody's closest friends in the wrestling business, was furious. He couldn't believe what had happened. "I was there," he said over and over. "I saw it. How could they let him go?" Dutch Mantell and others who had witnessed the incident were equally frustrated and heartbroken. What made things even worse was that the prosecution didn't appeal the decision. They didn't try to fix the mistakes that had been made or fight for justice. It was as if they just gave up and accepted the outcome. For Brody's friends, family, and fans, this felt like a slap in the face. With such a poorly handled case, it didn't take long for conspiracy theories to start flying. Some people wondered if Gonzalez had connections that helped him avoid punishment. He was a local wrestling star in Puerto Rico, and many believed he may have received special treatment. Others thought there might have been a cover-up, with key evidence or testimony intentionally left out of the trial. The lack of clear answers only added to the pain. For wrestling fans, it wasn't just about losing one of their heroes. It was about the fact that justice hadn't been served. The questions surrounding Brody's death lingered, and the official story didn't sit right with anyone. Bruiser Brody's death left a deep scar on the wrestling world. He was more than just a talented wrestler. He was a larger-than-life figure who inspired countless fans and fellow wrestlers. But instead of being remembered solely for his incredible career, his legacy became tied to the tragedy of his death and the failure of the legal system to hold his killer accountable. To this day, Brody's story remains one of the darkest chapters in wrestling history. It's a reminder of how even the most straightforward cases can fall apart when systems fail and people don't do their jobs. His death also raised awareness about the challenges wrestlers face, not just in the ring, but in their personal lives and dealings with the law. Justice for Bruiser Brody wasn't just about one man. It was about holding someone accountable for taking a life and showing that no one is above the law. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Instead, the case exposed flaws in the legal process and left the wrestling community feeling betrayed and heartbroken. In an industry where legends fade quickly, one man's memory refused to die. Bruiser Brody's death shocked the wrestling world, but it's what happened next that truly cemented his place in history. How did a controversial figure become one of wrestling's most revered icons? Brody's influence on professional wrestling is like a fingerprint, unique and impossible to erase. His career spanned promotions like WWE, NJPW, and NWA, where he racked up championships and left audiences in awe. But it's not just the titles that made Brody special. It was that wild, uncontrollable persona that set the standard for future wrestlers. Think about it. Every time you see a big, scary dude stomping around the ring, swinging chains and terrifying fans, that's Brody's DNA right there. Wrestlers like Eddie Kingston, The Undertaker, and Steve Austin, they all took a page from Brody's playbook. Even modern stars like Brody King proudly carry on his legacy. King's name is a tribute to both Bruiser Brody and the late Brody Lee, showing how Brody's impact spans generations. But here's the crazy part. Brody's influence goes way beyond what happens in the ring. His tragic death exposed the dark underbelly of wrestling. Suddenly, everyone was talking about wrestlers' safety and legal protections. It was like someone turned on the lights in a very dark room, and nobody liked what they saw. The wrestling world couldn't let Brody's story fade away. They inducted him into Hall after Hall of Fame, WWE, St. Louis Wrestling, Wrestling Observer Newsletter. It's like they're saying, never forget this man, never forget what happened. And people haven't forgotten. Brody's life and death have become the stuff of legend. There's a podcast called The Ballad of Bruiser Brody that digs into his story. The TV show Dark Side of the Ring dedicated an entire episode to unraveling the mystery of his death. It's like the wrestling world is still trying to make sense of what happened all those years ago. So what can we learn from Brody's story? Maybe it's that true legends never really die. Or that sometimes the most controversial figures leave the biggest marks. Or maybe it's a warning about the dangers that can lurk behind the curtain in the world of professional wrestling. One thing's for sure, Bruiser Brody's legend isn't fading anytime soon. His story continues to captivate new generations of wrestling fans. It's a tale of triumph and tragedy, of a man who lived large and left us too soon. In the end, Brody didn't just change wrestling, he became a part of its very DNA. In the end, all I can say is, Bruiser Brody's death ripped the mask off professional wrestling. It showed us the ugly side of the business, the real dangers lurking behind the scenes. But Brody's legacy? It's bigger than that tragic night in Puerto Rico. Bruiser Brody's story is one of the most compelling and tragic tales in the history of professional wrestling. Known for his larger-than-life persona and untamed charisma, Brody captivated fans across the globe, leaving an indelible mark on the industry. But his untimely and violent death exposed the dark underbelly of wrestling, one rife with unchecked egos, blurred lines between fiction and reality, and a justice system ill-equipped to handle its complexities. His death wasn't just a loss for his fans and loved ones, it was a wake-up call for the entire wrestling world. It forced the industry to confront uncomfortable truths about its culture, from the dangers wrestlers faced in and out of the ring to the power imbalances behind the scenes. Brody's passing became a cautionary tale that still resonates, urging reforms in wrestler safety, accountability, and legal protections. Yet despite the tragedy, Bruiser Brody's legacy transcends his untimely end. His influence can be seen in countless wrestlers who adopted his chaotic energy, uncompromising style, and fearless spirit. From legends like The Undertaker and Steve Austin to modern stars like Brody King, his impact spans generations. His name is etched into the history books, celebrated in Hall of Fame inductions, documentaries, and podcasts that ensure his story will never be forgotten. More importantly, Brody's life and career remind us of the enduring power of wrestling's larger-than-life characters. He was a man who lived by his own rules, entertained millions, and left a legacy that continues to inspire. While justice for his murder remains elusive, his influence is undeniable, proving that legends never truly die. Bruiser Brody may have been taken from us too soon, but his spirit lives on in every wrestler who dares to defy expectations and every fan who remembers his name. Thank you for sticking with us through this incredible and heartbreaking journey into the life and death of Bruiser Brody. His story is more than just a wrestling tragedy. It's a reminder of the highs and lows of the industry we all love. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into wrestling's untold stories. Share this video with fellow fans who need to hear about Brody's legacy and the lessons his story teaches us. What do you think about the shocking events surrounding Bruiser Brody's death? Could the wrestling world have done more to ensure justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this heartbreaking but important chapter in wrestling history. And remember, wrestling isn't just about the moves or the rivalries. It's about the people, their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. Bruiser Brody's story may have ended in tragedy, but his legacy reminds us why we're drawn to the ring in the first place.